Good evening, and welcome to the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation. I'm Bob Perry, the museum's executive director. Tonight's talk on 19th century Irish labor and working conditions on the canals and railroads by our Director of Education, Dr. Kate Viens, is groundbreaking here for at least two reasons. To begin with, this is the first event we've hosted before an in-person audience in 25 months, since the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020. And it's so wonderful to have all of you here with us, both here in our main gallery as well as online. We're doing our inaugural hybrid event as well. We've never done an in-person and online simultaneously event before. And this also means that you here among us can experience this talk again by viewing it online, because it'll be resident on our YouTube channel. But more importantly, this is the first time we've collaborated on a larger thematic project with sister institutions to help illuminate a historical event. It's been a great experience for us to partner with the Lowell National Historical Park, the Lowell Irish Cultural Committee, and the Middlesex Canal Museum on a series of Irish canal builders' heritage events, marking the bicentennial of Mr. Hugh Comiskey leading a team of Irish immigrant canal diggers who had been working in Boston up to Lowell to help speed up the development of the now legendary Lowell Canal System. In particular, we'd like to thank Jeremiah Breen from the Middlesex Canal Museum, and especially Kevin Coffey from the Lowell National Historical Park, who took the crucial leadership step of pulling us all together and making sure we brought this project home. To learn more about the Irish Canal Builders Heritage Event series, of which this talk is a part, you'll find a link to the complete schedule on the Lowell National Historical Park's website. We link to it in the YouTube chat stream, but you can also find it in a quick Google search. Those of you here in person will have found a flyer in your seat, which has all of the details as well. Finally, we here at the Charles River Museum are grateful to the Lowell Institute for their generous support of our Mill Talks lecture series. The Lowell Institute has been supporting free lectures in Greater Boston since 1836. Think about that. Okay, it's time to introduce Kate. Dr. Kate Viens joined the Charles River Museum team as our Director of Education in early 2021. She earned her PhD in American and New England Studies at Boston University in 2020. Her distinguished career includes past directorships at the Old Colony History Museum in Taunton, Massachusetts, and at the New England Museum Association. Before returning to university to earn her doctorate, though, she served at the Massachusetts Historical Society as research coordinator and book review editor, and finally as director of research and editor of the Massachusetts Historical Review. Kate is an exceptional researcher and storyteller, and we're lucky to have her here delivering this program this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Kate Viens.
Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. I'm so happy to be here to talk with you as part of the Irish Canal Builders celebration. It was 200 years ago yesterday, as Bob mentioned, that you, Comiskey, and a group of Irish laborers from Charlestown arrived in Lowell to begin work on the power canal system for the Merrimack Manufacturing Company. They had been hired by the Boston Associates, the investors who built the Boston Manufacturing Company here in 1814 and wanted to expand to a new location. As part of this commemoration, Brian Mitchell, the author of the book Paddy Camps, gave a talk on the Lowell Irish that St. Patrick's Parish in Lowell sponsored a few weeks ago. A recent program at the Middlesex Canal Museum focused on the economic value of that earlier transportation canal. The history of the water power system itself will be the subject of another Mill Talk here at the museum in May by Brown Professor Emeritus Pat Malone on May 25th. These talks highlight Irish social history, economic history, and industrial archaeology. In my talk this evening, I'll be focusing our attention on the labor history of the canal and railroad projects. History is the study of change over time. So what I hope to do with you this evening is to impress on you the continuities and the rapid, dramatic changes of the 1820s and 1830s. To answer the question, what was daily life like for these Irish laborers? It's absolutely essential to understand the towns in which they landed and the environment in which they earned their living. It's also important to have a grasp of the scale of the projects in which they were involved. And then I'm going to switch gears and present a case study, an in-depth look at an Irish labor action that occurred only a dozen years after the Irish arrived in Lowell. And then we'll unpack the significance of that. So I'll begin this evening by talking about about the rural New England landscape and the history of improvements there. The first thing to understand is that Yankee farmers themselves were no strangers to hard labor. We're all familiar with the iconic stone walls they constructed. Many of them also were involved in damming local streams to generate water power. This photo from southeastern Massachusetts gives you an indication of what a small dam looked like. Just above the waterfall are two parallel rows of stones. Those were the retaining walls for the earthen dam. This view upstream shows you how even the remnants of this small dam today create a little bit of a ponding in the brook. And then this view downstream gives you an indication of the level of water power, the potential for water power on this stream. A higher dam, perhaps with a sluiceway, would have generated even more power. I'm going to show you a lot of modern photos today, photos that I took, because, well, first of all, we're talking about an era before photography. But I also, I want you to explore New England. And as you'll see photos from the Blackstone Valley and Sturbridge and Lowell and southeastern Massachusetts, I want you to get out and explore these sites because the industrial history and the labor history are all around us. So in the early 19th century, water power was used to lighten the burden of processing raw materials that were essential to food, clothing, and shelter, to processing grain, fibers for yarn, and lumber. So this is the grist mill at Old Sturbridge Village, and this is the carding mill, where fibers were straightened for spinning. This carding mill, incidentally, used a different kind of water wheel than the one you saw in the last photo. There was a sluiceway that sent water to a horizontally laid wheel that had curved blades, which then powered the axles and the pulleys and the belts that ran the equipment. New Englanders didn't only build dams to harvest water power from local rivers. They also improved river navigation by digging transportation canals parallel to rivers to avoid obstacles such as waterfalls and rapids. The Pawtucket Canal on the Merrimack River in East Chelmsford is one example. It opened in 1796, and we'll be talking more about that later. Soon, New Englanders drew water from rivers to create larger artificial waterways. For example, the Middlesex Canal, which opened in 1802, connected Boston with the Merrimack River. These projects, along with road improvements such as turnpikes, were built with Yankee labor. Now, this is the Blackstone Canal in Uxbridge, which opened in 1828 and ran from Worcester to Providence. The Blackstone Canal was another transportation canal developed by incorporators who raised funds for its construction and then charged passenger fares and freight rates for its use. Notice the towpath for draft animals who pulled freight barges along the canal. After the business folded in 1848, local businesses drew from the canal to power manufacturing. And so, this is a darker photo, but it's of the Stanley Woolen Mill in Uxbridge on the canal. The Blackstone Canal is significant to our story because it was built by Irish labor. And so I'm giving you a sense of the landscape. In 1822, Kirk Boot, the agent for the Merrimack Manufacturing Company, went to Charlestown to find Irish laborers for Lowell to the north. In the case of the Blackstone Canal, the civil engineer Benjamin Wright, who was also working on the Erie Canal, furnished workers for the Rhode Island project. Many stayed in the area and then found work on the Boston and Providence Railroad in 1832, a few years after the Blackstone Canal was completed. And this is just a fun photo from the Mohawk Valley Welcome Center in New York State of a canal barge, a much smaller scale canal barge that is in their children's play area. And this slide shows you why Irish workers were able to move from one project to the next. Keep in mind that these were pre-famine Irish. The potato famine began in 1845. America had not yet experienced the influx of the poorest, most destitute Catholic and Gaelic-speaking Irish. Labor was scarce in this period, and engineering projects were only becoming larger and more sophisticated. A canal had to be properly constructed, or it wouldn't hold water. To build the Erie Canal, Benjamin Wright brought Irish workers over from England, where they had been working on navigation projects, England's canal system. And I'm sure you've heard the term navvies. In the US, they joined a small Irish population of farmers and tradesmen who had emigrated at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. Still, to onlookers, they were common laborers, and they were foreigners. And the historian Peter Way has said that unskilled common laborers, such as those who worked on canals and railroads, quote, were more fully exploited, worse off economically, socially fragmented, and as a result, with a culture, or more accurately, cultures that reflected their alienation as much as a sense of community, end quote. In one example of exploitation, during the construction of the Blackstone Canal, the contractors advertised more jobs than they had available. This had the effect of driving down wages, which led the Irish laborers to strike against their employers and attack Yankee workers whom they perceived had undermined their position. However, according to one study of the Blackstone Canal workers, even the reduced wages that the canal contractors paid were higher than those paid by factory owners and much greater than the wages of farm laborers, right? So it's all relative. And this may have been true in the Blackstone Valley. New Blackstone Canal workers made 27.5 cents a day. Those with a year's experience made 35 cents a day, roughly $2.10 a week. The factories there in the Blackstone Valley, under what has come to be known as the Rhode Island system, employed families, including children, so their average wages may have been lower. Moreover, the canal companies also provided shanty housing for the workers, meals, and a daily ration of grog. In addition, as more construction projects got underway in Massachusetts, real wages may have increased due to the competition for workers. And this occurred in Maryland on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, where wages jumped from $8 to $10 a month in 1828 to $14 to $16 a month in 1831. Now, as an aside, here at the Boston Manufacturing Company in Waltham, and this is a photo of our museum right by the Charles River. At the Boston Manufacturing Company, which employed young adult women under what has come to be known as the Waltham system, the women earned roughly $2.40 a week in 1820, 30 cents more than the canal workers, although they had to pay a modest rate for room and board. I mentioned grog. basically rum and water. In this era, it would have been unusual not to provide alcohol on a regular basis to men who were doing backbreaking work. Farm workers, even some factory workers, received a daily ration of liquor, as did men working on canal and railroad projects. As Peter Way wrote in studying canalers, quote, alcohol must be seen as a component of real earnings, inevitably factored into labor costs and at times explicitly valued as part of the wage, end quote. In the end, the labor that the canal and railroad companies exacted from the workers, including the physical exertion it required and the danger, would have indicated to the workers whether or not their wages were fair in comparison with those of other occupations. So let's take a closer look at the nature of these projects. So this is the Boston Manufacturing Company's original 1814 factory, which is located at the opposite end of the mill from where we're sitting. You can see where the ground level windows change in this photo. That's the start of a later 1840s edition. So it was just the first section of the building that was built in 1814. You can see the Charles River Dam in this photo. This is a view from Moody Street. The power canal cut off to the left and ran along the opposite side of the building. Water then entered the lowest level of the building to turn the water wheels and then discharged back into the Charles River downstream. The Lowell Canal system grew to be much more complex. Remember the Pawtucket Canal I mentioned, which went around Pawtucket Falls in East Chelmsford? That was where the developers of the Boston Manufacturing Company decided to build the Francis Cabot Lowell, who had recently passed away. So this plan shows the direction of the Merrimack River indicated by the arrow. As I understand it, the power canals left the river out of the view of this sketch, probably where you see the letter L. And then split into the two main canals. One ran toward the Merrimack and the other toward the Concord River. I'm going to invite my colleagues from Lowell who are here to correct me if I'm wrong. Does that sound right? Okay, thank you. And this is a photo of the Boot Cotton Mill. And a photo of the North Canal. And then also on this plan, you can see the proposed route of the Boston and Lowell Railroad. It's that solid line that crosses the Concord River between Tewksbury and Chelmsford. And again, this gives you an idea of the scale of these 1820s improvement projects. So what was the work like for these men? I will say that most of my own research has been on railroads. So I'm going to share my research with you with the understanding that much of the labor on canal and railroad projects was the same. The days were long. In every type of weather, the men worked from sunrise to sunset 6 days a week. Their task was literally to rebuild the landscape. Before they could dig a canal or lay railroad ties, the men had to cut and haul trees, dig up roots, and move stone walls. For the railroad, they had to excavate and fill a rail bed with gravel below the frost line. And I think that the modern building code for frost line is something like 4.5 feet. It's a deep bed. Where the men encountered a ledge, the work was especially arduous. In May 1834, the Dedham Patriot newspaper regaled its readers with the saga of a deep cut on the Boston and Lowell Railroad. The rock ledge was partially bare at the top, but in other places it was covered by soil to a depth of 15 feet. Along 500 feet of the rail line, the men had to dig and blast to a depth of 35 feet. Using picks and shovels and draft horses, Boston and Lowell railroad workers excavated approximately 42,000 cubic yards of earth and rock. The workers continued their heavy labor even after they had prepared the rail bed. Although the men would have been relieved when the railroad decided to abandon the use of granite ties in favor of wooden ties, they struggled more with the heavier iron T-rails that came into use during this period. The original design of the Boston and Lowell Railroad called for rails that were called fish bellies. They were thicker in the center than toward the edges. But the plans for the Boston and Providence Railroad called for rolled iron T-rails. So these used more material. Their design featured the flat surface on which the locomotive wheels ran, but this was mounted atop a vertical bar. The T-rails weighed 55 pounds a yard, and the fish bellies weighed only 35 pounds a yard. So this was a difference to men who were hauling sections of rail every day. And it was a difference that they would have keenly felt. However, in the corporate records, there's no evidence that the directors considered the effects of this decision on the laborers. The construction records of the Boston and Lowell Railroad do demonstrate how workers entered into the company's calculations. On November 29, 1833, the railroad's agent, Patrick Tracy Jackson, who was Francis Cabot Lowell's brother-in-law and one of the developers of this mill, expressed his dissatisfaction with the estimated cost of building a bridge over a canal in Lowell. He wrote to Joel Lewis that Mr. Dresser was charging too much for drilling blocks. Quote, "I can send men up from here who'll do it for less. I pay but 15 cents each." Clearly then, under the best conditions, canal and railroad workers performed backbreaking labor at the discretion of capitalists and engineers who showed little concern for their efforts. Yet other circumstances, distasteful and dangerous, further colored their perceptions of the work they had agreed to perform for their rate of pay. In Attleboro, those who had been laid to rest in the Second Congregational Church burying ground, and you see the church here in this image, were directly in the path of the Boston and Providence rail line. Whether or not they were involved in the task of moving the graves to Irish Catholics with elaborate burial rituals that venerated the deceased, disturbing a burying ground must have seemed an appalling prospect. At times, the workers were building canals and laying rail beds in areas that were some distance away from town centers and factory villages. Sometimes they were pushing through wetlands, such as the swamp on this plan, and at other times they crossed established farms. The Boston and Providence Railroad made a formal agreement with a Sharon farmer, Jonathan Cobb, concerning the terms of crossing his land. It stated that Cobb would not claim damages as long as the railroad preserved his ability to carry out his farming activities. This included the construction of a legal and sufficient stone wall along the rail line, a dry bridge suitable for cattle to pass for water, and a passway for teams for removing hay from land lying westerly of said route, with gates at each end of said passway. One wishes there were a record of the Irish laborers' reaction to the task of improving a farm in the course of building a railroad. Did they admire the American laws that required the railroad to respect private property? Or did the work conjure up images of their families toiling on the estates of absentee Irish estates of absentee landlords. Keep in mind that with every year that went by, the workforce included more recent Irish immigrants and more immigrants coming directly from Ireland. Finally, any assessment of the Irish laborers' response to their wages must consider the dangers of their work. In late 1834, crews on the Boston and Worcester Railroad were cutting through a hill south of Worcester. Although winter came early that year, the contractors, Scottish brothers Andrew and George Ellis, insisted that the laborers press ahead in all weather. One man slipped on the ice and fell to his death. 4 people were killed by falling rock, some of which crashed into housing for the workers' families. Many others were killed in explosions. Irishmen who stopped work were fired. But in the face of so much injury and death, other crews halted their work. These men were armed with guns, and they threatened to shoot anyone who would evict or replace them. The railroad company brought in other trusted Irish contractors to mediate the dispute. The Ellises agreed to move the workers' dependents away from the job site, to pay higher wages for dangerous winter work, and to give the crew leaders or gang bosses the option of halting the work in bad weather. And finally, the blasters were given the right to reject any powder that they thought was unsafe. The Irish workers performed this labor in a challenging social context. This key to an 1832 map of Attleboro shows that the town had only 3,200 residents in 1830. To people who lived in these small towns, before the canals and railroads were even built, the construction of worker housing signaled demographic changes, the arrival of Irish workers and their families in significant numbers for the first time. When Irish moved into housing that the canal companies and railroads provided, the new neighborhoods represented to the townspeople the loss of a town's self-determination. Not only was the workers' arrival quite sudden, local residents recognized that the workers themselves didn't have the means voluntarily to settle among them. A canal or railroad corporation had brought the Irish there. But then the corporation appeared to bear little further responsibility as Irish families took up housekeeping, and the men set to work at the direction of gang leaders who reported to the corporation. The issue was not that the Irish were an entirely new ethnic group. Massachusetts already had a significant Irish population. Many early 19th century immigrants, including those who had built the Erie Canal and then moved to New England to work on other improvements projects, had come from Ireland's emerging middle class. Although they were skilled workers, spoke English, were literate, and often had English surnames, they still experienced deep prejudice. If they were Catholic, they couldn't hold office in Massachusetts until 1820, and there were multiple attacks on Irish Catholics starting in 1823. So again, I'm showing you that things are changing very, very rapidly during this period. And so I would note that those first immigrants who traveled from Ireland to England or to America were, again, workers who had a little bit more means. Often individuals need some means to be able to immigrate until the potato famine in 1845. So the railroad trackmen of the 1830s were in an even worse position. More of them were recent immigrants, former tenant farmers from the west of Ireland who had no other experience. They were illiterate, and Gaelic was often their native language. Their Catholic religion and Irish customs, which were unfamiliar or antithetical to Protestant Yankees, exacerbated this otherness. Famous preachers such as Lyman Beecher declared that Catholicism was akin to Satanism and anti-republicanism, but even local residents were afraid of papism. And this was the idea that Catholics couldn't become good citizens because they owed their allegiance to the Pope in Rome. The Irish were thus perceived as a threat to the social fabric of rural towns. Their shanty housing was in stark contrast to the textile mill villages of Waltham and Lowell, where the Boston Associates had recruited respectable Yankee farm girls to live and work alongside management in planned communities. Shoddy and unsanitary Irish housing only added to the levels of poverty in a community. No matter how they felt about canals and railroads, native New Englanders also considered the jobs the Irish were doing to be of little value and demeaning to the individual. Shoveling earth and laying track was grueling work that challenged Yankee notions of personal freedom. When I started this talk, I noted that the Yankee farmers were no strangers to hard labor, but they were working for themselves and on their own schedule. Canal and railroad workers also expanded the drinking culture of rural communities during the growth of the 19th century temperance movement. Heavy drinking was a custom the trackmen had carried with them from Ireland, where bachelors imbibed as a group. Certainly, intemperance, low educational levels, poor living conditions, illness, and injuries were not unique to Irish settlements. However, any expansion of these conditions was both tragic for the individuals who experienced them and increased the social costs and concerns of rural communities. Now, how did local residents encounter the Irish workers? In June 1835, 18-year-old Martha Parker of Worcester wrote to her father, who was away serving in the Massachusetts legislature, and she teased him, "Have you had a ride on the railroad yet? I have." In a letter now in the collection of the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, she wrote, "One afternoon last week, Mr. Kendall invited a party of ladies and gentlemen to walk down where they are at work. It was a beautiful day, and we went, and I assure you I had a grand time. Though when we got there, we found nothing very wonderful except a great rock into which the Paddies were digging with all their might. Yet we were able to form a slight idea of its appearance when done. The mud cars were running to and fro, so we thought we'd take a short ride. We did not sit down, but rode standing, so you can imagine that we did not go remarkably swift, not more than 20 miles an hour. The Paddy told us he would carry us for nothing. Quite obliging, don't you think so?" Martha had a grand time when she spontaneously went to watch the Irish building the railroad. She found the job site uninspiring, but, like the savviest teen, made a fast friend, snagged a bargain, and on a whim took a most unladylike and memorable ride in a mud wagon. Martha's letter reveals several truths about how Massachusetts residents encountered railroads. Men and women saw the landscape being remade before their eyes in an urgent fashion. Martha described a great rock that was being excavated with some effort as cars full of soil ran to and fro. Here, ladies and gentlemen of polite society would meet Irish immigrants crossing social boundaries in public encounters. The letter introduces us to the forces that were at work in what we call the contested spaces of the railroad construction sites. We don't know who Mr. Kendall was. He may have been an acquaintance, or he could have been a representative of the corporation who was eager to impress members of the family, of a prominent family. Yet a close reading of this correspondence also reveals the agency or the independence of the visitors and the workers. Martha said, "We thought we would take a short ride. The Paddy told us he would carry us for nothing." There's no indication of whether or not the railroad corporation sanctioned this activity. Martha's letter indicates that from the start, canal and railroad projects introduced another uncontrolled element into the environment, apart from the shanty towns I mentioned. Overall, railroad lines were not sites of chaos, but neither did they represent the kind of order and methodical progress that the railroad companies and public officials sought. On the construction site that Martha visited, rocks refused to budge, visitors showed up unannounced, and workers broke away from their labors to give free and potentially risky rides. Even with the help of foremen and professional engineers, railroad companies couldn't exert complete control over their employees and the natural environment in which they worked. During the 1830s and 40s, the bigotry and racism that Massachusetts residents exhibited toward immigrants, as well as the infirm and people of color, only grew. This even extended to those who had died. Personally, I'm always interested in seeing how names are represented in records and also occupations, how those are represented in the census records over time and in the course of demographic changes. So in 1849, the Fitchburg Railroad listed people who had been killed in railroad accidents in its annual report. These individuals were listed by name if they worked for the railroad, unless they were Irish, and given the dignity of their full names and title if they were middle-class Yankees, as a comparison of entries in the annual report attests. January 1st, 1849, an Irish laborer was killed by jumping off a snowplow in Charlestown. February 24th, a brakeman by the name of Whitcomb was killed by coming into contact with a bridge while carelessly standing on the top of the cars. August 24th, an operative by the name of Whittier was injured by shackling cars together at Charlestown so that he died the next morning. December 1st, a gravel train brake iron broke and threw the cars off the track, killing instantly 4 Irish laborers and slightly injuring 2 others. September 4th, Mr. Joseph B. Sweat was killed in Somerville by attempting to drive over the crossing. December 10th, an Irishman was killed on the Lexington and West Cambridge Road by attempting to drive a wagon over a crossing. Now I'd like to turn your attention to the ways in which Irish workers pushed back on these conditions, in ways both small and large. As we've seen, an unnamed Irishman gave Martha Parker a ride in a Boston and Worcester mud wagon. After Boston and Providence railroad workers had completed the construction of the enormous Canton Viaduct, they put a faithful old draft horse named Charlie on a flat car and pushed him over the bridge. Who were traditionally the first passengers on a new section of rail line? The corporate dignitaries. So the workers were not only having a bit of fun, they were stealing the spotlight, and they were mocking corporate elites. I've already told you how, in late 1834, armed Irishmen stopped work and won safety concessions on the Boston and Worcester Railroad. One historian, Carl Prince, has called 1834 the Great Riot Year. And so now I'd like to talk in greater depth about a strike that I believe will really give you a sense of the lived experience of Irish laborers, in particular when they clashed with rural New Englanders. And for those of you who are particularly interested in this story, I'll note that I've published my research and my interpretation of this event in a Dublin Seminar for New England Folklife volume called The Irish in New England. And those Dublin Seminar volumes are available through Historic Deerfield. Almost a riot. The Dedham Patriot newspaper declared in a headline of its April 24th, 1834 edition. The article went on to describe the previous week's labor action by Irish Catholic trackmen on the Boston and Providence Railroad line, under construction just south of the town. Yet the headline, "Almost a Riot," did not prevent the paper from using the term riot in describing the event, and in a lengthy article published 1 week later, the editors admitted that the chaos had been worse than they first reported. The Boston and Providence Railroad riot would prove to be an important event in the history of Massachusetts nativism, that anti-immigrant movement that culminated in the election of nativist state officials in the 1850s. The riot was a highly visible labor action that brought diverse groups of residents, including Irish laborers, rural Yankees, and railroad contractors, into direct contact with one another, even as it captured the attention of Boston railroad investors who were among the city's business and political leaders. The riot's significance was heightened by the fact that it brought to Massachusetts the same kind of mob violence that had pitted Irishmen against Protestant native-born Americans during an election riot a week earlier in Manhattan. 16 weeks after the riot I'm going to talk about, on August 11th, working-class Yankees burned the Ursuline Convent in Charlestown. Now, this event has received historical attention, and studies of the convent burning have maintained that the Mother Superior incited the rioters' ire by threatening to raise 20,000 Irishmen in defense of the convent. The Boston and Providence Railroad riot offered a recent, though more modest, example of just such a rally, as more than 200 trackmen rioted along approximately 16 miles of the rail line in the direction of Boston. The riot began not far from Boston, in Attleboro in the village of Dodgeville, near the Rhode Island state line. This is the section of that Attleboro map that I'm showing you. Here, as the frozen New England soil thawed in the spring of 1834, wagons dropped Irishmen, picks, shovels, and other supplies. The men surveyed their surroundings. A newly expanded cotton mill, 3 stories high, stretched 184 feet along the 10-mile river. Smoke curled from the chimney of a blacksmith shop. Families, bundled against the cold, moved quickly to attend to chores around 15 workers' cottages, many of them new. The Irishmen might have noticed a swarm of youth around a small wooden structure. A local historian described it as a new, commodious, and uncommonly well-finished schoolhouse where a school is kept the greater part of the year. There was no time for the Irishmen to linger over these observations because there were earth and iron to move. In his communication with the directors of the railroad, the engineer who managed the project, William Gibbs McNeill, gave every indication that construction would proceed smoothly. The general character of the line would be remarkably straight, he reported, and suitable materials to form a durable and solid foundation may be said to abound. The men, however, grew discontented. They expected hard labor, whether or not they were veterans of improvement projects, but they grew dissatisfied with their wages. A newspaper added that the men also demanded a daily ration of grog, a daily allowance of grog. On Friday, April 18, 1834, men on the Dodgeville section halted their work and began to incite others to join their turnout, marching north along the line. More than 140 men labored between Dodgeville and Mansfield, about 7 miles away. Among them, Thomas Forbes, John Hennessy, Patrick Lavelle, John Morris, Michael Nolly, and Dennis Rourke. Up to 100 rioters arrived at Mansfield, armed with clubs and stones, shouting, and in pursuit of the railroad contractors whom McNeill had hired to handle the construction. Forbes and the 5 others named above chased down and beat William Stahl of Mansfield. They also physically assaulted Jacob Stever. According to a newspaper report, the rioters, quote, gathered every laborer on the road into their ranks. They compelled those who were unwilling to accompany them at the peril of their lives. In fact, they cleared the whole road, end quote. The mob also threatened to demolish 1 or 2 homes where they thought that workers who didn't want to join them were hiding. The rioting continued until the following day. While the Dodgeville rioters were on the march, another group, 7 miles north of Mansfield, attempted to halt construction of the railroad in Sharon. John Fitzsimmons, James Hay, Jeremiah Morris, Robert Welch, Martin Dunn, and 30 others made a disturbance for more than 4 hours, quote, to the great terror of the people thereabout inhabiting. By April 19th, the number of men rioting along this stretch of the line had grown to more than 100. They stopped the construction at Canton, 3 miles north of Sharon, where a dozen men, including Fitzsimmons, Hay, Morris, and Welch, threatened the lives of other workers and injured Elijah Carmichael of Canton. Martin Dunn, meanwhile, went after Daniel Carmichael and John Roach. Dunn hurt Roach so severely that he was tried separately for the crime. According to one newspaper report, the mob that converged at Sharon was about 300 strong. Another paper, which reported on the rioting at Mansfield, put the number at 400. A comparison of the complaints with the trial records shows that for the purposes of prosecution, counselors conservatively estimated that 200 men or more took part in the rioting. Moreover, not all local residents tried or were able to avoid the melee. The sheer numbers created a situation beyond the control of local law enforcement in Bristol and Norfolk counties, because of course we're in 2 different counties here. And so as a result, 2 militia companies, the Washington Rifle Corps of Attleboro and the Stoughton Grenadiers, mustered at the sheriff's request. They helped to restore order, made arrests, and 11 individuals were brought to trial, and they guarded the imprisoned men. They continued under arms until order was fully restored in the middle of the following week. The first persons to encounter the rioters had been local residents, a number of whom were later ordered to appear in court as witnesses to the event. Many of those summoned were probably native Yankees, judging by their surnames and by the nature of the communities, the limited number of recent immigrants in these small towns in eastern Massachusetts, in southeastern Massachusetts. These men may have been unable to avoid the advancing mobs. In contrast, following the arrival of the sheriffs and constables, the Attleboro and Stoughton militia companies were the first groups of men directly to confront the rioters and not just not be able to get out of the way. A record of the captains of the Washington Rifle Corps indicates that they too were native Yankees. Virgil Blackstone, Chester Bugby, Elihu Daggett Jr., William Everett, David Holman, William Robinson. More significantly, of the 6 militia officers, 2 of them, Robinson and Blackington, were Attleboro manufacturers, and 3 others, Bugby, Daggett, and Everett, bore surnames that were associated with industry in 1834. Robinson was a partner in Robinson, Jones and Company, which manufactured gilt buttons, consumed 40 tons of Lehigh, Pennsylvania coal a year, and marketed its product internationally. In terms of both their class and ethnicity then, the militia captains were at odds with the Irish laborers. Their business interests suggest that though they lived in the countryside, they were probably members of the Whig Party, which was associated with industry. And they probably had little affinity for Jacksonian democratic politics. More to the point, their investments in factory production that required raw materials and effective shipping methods would have given them a strong incentive to see the railroad construction be completed without incident. Now, in contrast, the corporate directors of the Boston and Providence Railroad never confronted the rioters face to face. On Monday, April 21st, 3 of the railroad's 4 Boston directors, including Paul Revere's son, Joseph Warren Revere, attended their regular meeting in Boston. The official record, which is in the collection of the Baker Library at Harvard, gives no indication of their conversation, but it's likely that they discussed the riot, which, as a Taunton newspaper later reported, was still unfolding. Revere was the owner of the Revere Copper Company, located near the path of the railroad in Canton, so he would have been informed of the riot. In addition, an article that appeared in a Boston newspaper 3 days later suggests that some version of the event was common knowledge even in the city. It describes the April 22nd accidental poisoning of an Irish laborer, quote, recently from the Providence Railroad, one of the gang who lately struck for wages, end quote. Yet in the director's minutes of this and every subsequent meeting prior to the stockholders' annual meeting in June, the din of the rioters was completely silenced. The directors had no desire to alarm current or potential supporters who might gain access to the minutes, or to record this unpleasant event for posterity. Discussing the riot would call into question the effectiveness of the railroad management, raise the specter of additional labor unrest, suggest the possibility of future delays, and perhaps even frighten away investors. Instead, the directors blamed construction delays only on the scale of the work and the difficulty of obtaining enough iron from England. Despite their reticence, the April riot, which had involved hundreds of hired men and disrupted work for days along nearly 20 miles of the rail line, was still on the directors' minds. They felt a special obligation to acknowledge those men who had risked their lives in the service of the corporation. At the June 4th stockholders' meeting, the directors commended the contractors who had tried to protect their interests. The directors applauded what they called, quote, the good understanding that prevailed between the contractors and the directors, quote, by which our labors have been lightened and the welfare of the company has been essentially promoted, end quote. Still, anxious not to draw attention to the riot, the directors omitted this commendation from the published annual report. But railroad executives throughout the Commonwealth quickly and quietly reviewed their policies. For example, within a week, the directors of the Boston and Worcester Railroad voted that no person shall be employed by the corporation who is in the habit of using ardent spirit. This action mandated the dismissal of habitual drinkers of hard liquor, whom the Boston and Worcester directors had considered to be a source of dissension within the workforce. Yet the causes of the Boston and Providence Railroad riot were deeper and more complex than the directors could have imagined. The causes are what I described earlier. Long hours, backbreaking labor, little concern on the part of the company for the ways in which its decisions affected the workers, dangerous working conditions, management that didn't listen to their grievances, false advertising about the number of jobs available, low wages, poor living conditions, and an environment of religious and ethnic prejudice. The Boston and Providence riot is historically significant. Unlike other riots, including the Boston and Worcester riot that I mentioned, it didn't center on a single job site, a factory, or even a neighborhood. Instead, it demonstrated the ability of Irish workers to reach across the Massachusetts landscape and influence authorities at the heart of the state's economic and political systems. And there's a cultural geographer whose work I like very much, John Brinkerhoff Jackson. And he says that roads are a visible element of the political landscape. Some roads converge on towns and draw men and women together. Others disregard the local environment, cutting through the countryside along the most direct routes to serve political, military, and commercial ends. The goal of this centrifugal network is to carry power and influence across a geographic region. The Boston and Providence Railroad, as well as the Boston and Worcester, the Boston and Lowell, the larger canal projects, all represent the intention of capitalists to exert their influence throughout a region. They rallied investors, and in the case of the Boston and Providence, in June 1831, they secured a charter from the state legislature. Lawmakers passed the bill in the interest of economic development, yet the construction and operation of the railroad remained firmly in the hands of the Boston and Providence directors. All power flowed from the offices in Boston through McNeil and his assistant engineers via the contractors and subcontractors along that linear route toward Providence. It made itself known in every section that the engineers had designated, in every order that the gang bosses gave to the Irish workers. For a short time then, Dennis Rourke, Martin Dunn, and their fellow rioters succeeded in reversing the flow of this power. First, they halted construction. Then they placed local residents, law enforcement officials, and the railroad's management on the defensive, even chasing William Stahl, who may have been one of the contractors whose life was, quote, in imminent danger and saved by great exertions. Moreover, by some means, the activities of the mob that marched north toward Boston from Dodgeville to Mansfield were communicated even farther up the line at Sharon, where rioters began their march toward Canton. From the end of the line in Dodgeville, the rioting pushed more than 17 miles into the backyard of the railroad directors, including Joseph Warren Revere. In fact, as the directors' commendation of their contractors at the 1834 annual meeting attests, the rioters drove their message right into the offices of the Boston and Providence Railroad Company. The method that the rioters chose to redress their grievances is significant. They didn't peaceably stop work. Instead, they armed themselves and proceeded to hunt down the contractors who had set their wages and therefore were responsible for their dissatisfaction. This may have necessitated marching to Mansfield, but the fact that the Dodgeville rioters incited others to join them indicates that they believed their grievances were pervasive and that there was strength in numbers. Up to this point, the mob seems to have followed the pattern of other rioting in this period. Yet the fact that the workers didn't stay within their sections of the line, but continued to press northward raises the question of where they were heading. Now, one local historian has speculated that they were carrying their grievances to the State House, but there's no proof that that was the rioters' destination. If they were seeking the railroad directors, it could have been for the purpose of gaining concessions. The fact remains that the men marched toward the power centers of both the railroad company and the government of the Commonwealth. Furthermore, they chose an auspicious weekend on which to start a riot, the anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775. For decades, nativist activity was focused on holidays. After the Revolution, Americans continued the English practice of parading effigies, called paddies, on St. Patrick's Day. In 1824, Protestant canal workers at Lockport, New York, rioted in celebration of the victory of William of Orange in the Battle of the Boyne. The Irishmen returned the favor. On July 4th, 1835, a crew in Detroit that was grading the streets stopped working and began to heckle non-Irish passers-by. It's also worth observing that the Boston and Providence Railroad Riot occurred just 2 weeks after the Easter octave, the 8-day period in the liturgical calendar that begins on Easter Sunday and ends the following Sunday when priests read the Gospel of Doubting Thomas. The faithful among the Irish who were caught up in the melee would have recently experienced an Easter celebration that carried messages of triumph over persecution and faith in the presence of desperate odds. Whether the Revolutionary Anniversary was the immediate cause of the Boston and Providence riot, or whether the delivery of payroll, a construction problem, word of the election riots, or some other incident sparked that Friday's events, the Irish workers would have noted the symbolism of the patriotic holiday. Their awareness of the American political system, however, was even greater. Prior to the 1830s, the Irish had not held much influence in the American political process. By the time of the Boston and Providence riot, this situation had been slowly changing for more than a decade, since the Irish arrival in Lowell, in fact. For this, the laborers had to thank the generation of skilled English-speaking Irish that came to the U.S. to begin the construction of the Erie Canal in 1817. As they gained greater responsibility on American public works projects, these men became leaders in the immigrant community, and they favored Jacksonian democracy. In contrast, the unskilled laborers who made up most of the workforce on the railroad were drawn from the poorer pool of lower-class men who remained itinerant workers, or from the ranks of poor Gaelic-speaking immigrants who had began to come to America in the 1830s from the western provinces of Ireland. As their actions indicate, however, the Boston and Providence rioters had enough political presence of mind to imagine a destination and to behave in a proactive and relatively restrained fashion. There's no record that they caused property damage, and it's even difficult to determine the extent of the personal injuries that they committed, because the court records apparently used pro forma language to describe the assaults. So in the court record, Martin Dunn attacked John Roach, quote, to his great injury, sufficient to be tried separately for the crime. But he also committed wrongs, quote, to the great injury of the said Daniel Carmichael. Overall, the Boston and Providence rioters' actions represent a group whose combined Irish and American experiences had convinced them that some restraint was advisable because they had an opportunity to be heard and perhaps even to effect a change in their working conditions. The rioters' behavior after the event may also indicate that they didn't believe that their actions were beyond the limits of acceptable agitation in the Jacksonian era. Over the weekend of April 19th and 20th, all of the accused remained in the area. The arrests were made between Monday and Wednesday. Yet to the local residents caught in the melee, the rioters were indeed foreigners, as the Dedham newspaper reported. The locals had been terrified by the mobs of rampaging Irish who came out of the countryside to descend on their villages, shouting, perhaps in Gaelic, assaulting their neighbors, and bringing out the sheriffs and the militia. It didn't matter that justice for those arrested in Norfolk County had been swift, occurring on Monday, April 28th. At the beginning of May, the popular national newspaper Niles Register claimed that the Boston and Providence riot was a precursor of more mob violence. Quote, many incidents like the riot may be expected in the present state of things. The idea of periling the lives of persons, however, because they will not pay higher wages, cannot be tolerated. In what may have been a reflection of the public's growing nativism, the sentences that those arrested in Bristol County received in June were somewhat harsher than the judgments handed down in Norfolk County. The Boston and Providence Railroad Riot of April 1834 has largely remained absent from the body of historical scholarship on mobs, Irish immigration, internal improvements, and antebellum labor. Yet studying this event allows us to appreciate railroad laborers' ability to challenge political and economic power and authority in the early 19th century. It lets us explore Irish assimilation into American political culture through the study of unskilled workers who engaged in the popular democratic practice of mob action and proactively sought the redress of their grievances beyond their immediate circumstances on their own section of the rail line. And finally, it enhances our knowledge of how riots affected corporations and the public's response to workers whom they perceived to be Irish first and laborers second. Thus, it adds to our understanding of the development of nativism. In an event that was almost a riot, Dunn, Hennessy, Rourke, and their fellow Irishmen accomplished a great deal indeed. I'll leave you with an image of the Canton Viaduct, which was one of the Irish railroad workers' greatest achievements. It's on the historic American Engineering Register. It was originally one track wide. The second track was added, the top was widened, and the arches were filled in during World War II to support the movement of war material. As you can see, it's still in use today as part of Amtrak's Northeast Corridor and the MBTA commuter rail line to Providence. And it is that, if you've been on the train to Providence, it is that section of the trip when the train slows and might tip a little bit if you're in a two-story car, and you can look down on the old Paul Revere site. The Irish canalers and railroad workers left quite a legacy. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
And if you do, come to this microphone so that we capture your voice.
I'm giving you an awful lot to think about. Any questions through our YouTube chat?
Hi, Kate. Do you have any idea how you, Comiskey, and others got the training to do the work that they did when they came over? Do you know if they were experienced somehow?
I don't know that much about those laborers in Charlestown. I wish I knew what they were doing, exactly what they were working on in Charlestown. And this is probably a good point to mention that there is going to be a program in Lowell on Sunday at 1 o'clock at the National Park Service Visitor Center. And I'm going to be taking part along with Bob Forant from UMass Lowell, and Dave, you're going to be there, and other colleagues from the Jeremiah Breen from the Middlesex Canal Museum. It's going to be a panel conversation about the Irish workers, and we'd love to see you there.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry that I don't have the answer to that question.
Kate, there are a couple of questions
Okay.
online. The most recent one is, were the Corkonians involved?
Do my colleagues who are here who are familiar with Irish history have the answer to that? They were. Can you describe who they were? Would you like to go to the mic?
Well, in Lowell anyway, the people from Cork and Dublin were on different sides, and very often they met in the middle, and cause riots that way. So they were, it was county against county.
Yes, yes. So if the question is, were they involved in the riot that I've described, I don't believe that they were. But those riots between the Irishmen from different counties who emigrated together, found work together, and then fought one another, that is described in, I believe, I referenced the historian Peter Way and his book, Common Labor, about the Canalers in the Mid-Atlantic. And so I believe that he talks about that in his book.
Also from the chat, how common was English versus Irish Gaelic spoken in Ireland at this time? And was English a second language to a lot of working class or rural Irish, or was English not spoken at all?
My understanding is that it depends on the county that you were in and the part of Ireland that you were in, and that the western part of Ireland was more Gaelic speaking. Again, to my colleagues here who have, was that an appropriate answer? Yeah, that's what I understand. It really depended on the county. Yeah. Good questions. There is so much to explore about this history, and as I mentioned, my own scholarship has primarily been on the railroads and railroads in rural New England, which is what brought me to studying the Irish, and I'm just so pleased that there is such an interest now in the working class history, in the labor history, in the Irish history, and other ethnic histories that we have to explore. It's completely expanded our areas of study, and we're learning so much all the time. So thank you very much again for being here in person. It's been wonderful to have a live audience to speak with. And thank you everyone at home for joining us this evening, and have a good night. Thank you very much.